The crystalline being stumbled through the airlock of the human space station, its translucent body flickering with patterns of distress that no human could understand. Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrian Council had traveled across half the galaxy to reach this forbidden place, this system that most civilized species marked on their star charts with warnings and symbols of death. Earth hung below them like a blue marble wrapped in swirling white clouds, but Veltar knew better than to be fooled by its beauty. This was a death world, a planet so hostile that it had forged the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever known. The very air here could kill most aliens, the gravity would crush their bones, and the weather patterns were violent beyond comprehension. Captain Jake Morrison approached the alien visitor with careful steps, his boots making metallic sounds on the station floor. He was tall by human standards, with dark hair and the kind of scars that came from a lifetime of military service. His eyes were forward-facing like all humans, marking him as a predator species, and when he smiled his exposed teeth made Veltar's crystalline form shiver with ancient fear. "Welcome to Luna Station," Morrison said in the common galactic tone, his voice carrying undertones that reminded Veltar of hunting calls. "I am Captain Morrison of the Earth Defense Fleet. You requested an emergency meeting with human leadership." Veltar's form pulsed with desperate colors as he activated his translation device. The words that came out were fractured and filled with static, but the meaning was clear enough. "Captain Morrison, I am Ambassador Veltar. My people are dying. We need your help." Morrison gestured toward a conference room, and Veltar noticed how the human moved with fluid grace, despite his obvious physical strength. All the stories were true then. These creatures were built for violence, their very bodies designed by evolution to hunt and kill. Even their casual movements carried the promise of sudden, explosive action. The conference room was stark and functional, designed for beings who cared more about efficiency than comfort. Morrison activated a communication link, and within minutes the room filled with the holographic projections of other human military leaders. Veltar recognized them from intelligence briefings. Admiral Lisa Kane, a woman whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by her willingness to accept massive casualties for strategic victory. General Pete Sullivan, whose ground forces had turned entire worlds into graveyards during the human civil conflicts. Commander Amy Foster, whose naval squadrons were known throughout human space for their refusal to retreat under any circumstances. "Admiral Kane," Morrison said, "the Zephyrian ambassador has requested emergency assistance. Their civilization is under attack." Kane's hologram turned toward Veltar, and the alien felt a chill run through his crystalline structure. The woman's eyes held the same predatory focus as Morrison's, but there was something else there, a cold calculation that suggested she viewed entire star systems as pieces on a strategic board. "Ambassador," Kane said, "please explain your situation." Veltar's form brightened as he began to speak, his desperation overriding his fear of these dangerous beings. 12 star systems have fallen to the Korthik Empire in the past galactic year. They are ruthless, Admiral Kane. They destroy everything in their path, enslave entire populations, strip worlds of their resources until nothing remains but empty. Rock. He paused, allowing his translation device to process the emotional undertones of his species' language. "The Korthik war fleets are approaching our homeworld. Our defensive forces cannot stop them. We have perhaps 6 of your Earth months before Zephy's prime falls, and my people join the billions who have already died." General Sullivan leaned forward in his hologram, and Veltar noticed the human's scarred hands and the way his shoulders carried the weight of countless battles. "What makes you think we can help where your own forces have failed?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Veltar realized he was at the crucial moment that would determine his species' survival. He had studied human military history during his journey to their space, accessing records that most galactic civilizations kept classified. The humans had fought wars that defied all conventional understanding of conflict, battles with coddles, accepted casualty rates that would cause any other species to surrender immediately, campaigns where they turned their own homeworld into a battlefield rather than yield to enemy forces. "Because you are Deathworlders," Veltar said simply. "Your species evolved on a planet that kills, and it made you into killers. The Korthik have never faced anything like humans before." Commander Foster's hologram flickered as she accessed data files. "We've heard of the Korthik Empire. They follow standard galactic warfare protocols, minimize casualties, maintain honor codes, retreat when losses exceed acceptable parameters." "Exactly," Veltar said, his form pulsing with hope. "They have never encountered a species that views death as merely inconvenient. They have never fought beings who grow stronger when their companions fall, who use their own pain as fuel for greater violence." Admiral Kane was silent for long moments, and Veltar could see her mind working through tactical possibilities. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of command decisions that had shaped human history. "What can your people offer in exchange for our military assistance?" Veltar's crystalline body brightened with anticipation. This was what he had traveled across the galaxy to propose. "Our energy shield technology. It is far superior to anything humans currently possess. With Zephyrian shields, your warships would be nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons." The human leaders exchanged glances through their holographic connection, and Veltar could sense the predatory interest that his offer had awakened. These were beings who understood the value of superior defensive systems, especially when combined with their already terrifying offensive capabilities. "There is something else," Veltar continued, his voice dropping to undertones that his translation device struggled to process. "The Korthik have never retreated from a conquered system. Never. But if humans were to defeat them, to demonstrate that their expansion can be stopped, it would send a message throughout the galaxy. Other aggressive species would think twice before starting wars of conquest." General Sullivan smiled, and the expression made Veltar's form flicker with instinctive terror. "You want us to make an example of them." "I want you to do what humans do best," Veltar replied. "I want you to show the galaxy why Earth is marked as a forbidden world on every star chart. I want you to remind the universe that there are some species too dangerous to provoke." Admiral Kane stood from her command chair, and even through the holographic projection, Veltar could feel the woman's presence like a gathering storm. "Ambassador, you should understand something about human warfare before we proceed. When we commit to military action, we don't simply defeat our enemies. We break them so completely that the very memory of their defeat serves as a warning to others." "That is exactly what I am hoping for," Veltar said. Kane nodded slowly. "Colonel Dan Hayes will begin assembling the first human expeditionary force. Immediately, Dr. Helen Parker will analyze your tactical data and begin planning integration of Zephyrian technology with human weapon systems. Captain Morrison will coordinate fleet deployment." She paused, and her next words carried a finality that made Veltar's crystalline form resonate with harmonics of both hope and terror. "Ambassador, your people asked for help from Deathworlders. You're about to discover exactly what that means." The holographic projections faded, leaving Veltar alone with Captain Morrison in the Stark conference room. The human was studying data files on his personal display, already beginning the process that would mobilize the most dangerous military force the galaxy had ever known. "Captain," Veltar said quietly, "there is something else you should know about the Korthik. They consider themselves the ultimate warriors, the apex predators of galactic civilization." Morrison looked up from his display, and his smile held all the warmth of nuclear fire. "Ambassador, They're about to learn the difference between being apex predators and being human. Outside the station windows, Earth continued its ancient rotation, the death world that had forged a species capable of turning warfare itself into an art form. Soon, the galaxy would remember why some planets were best left undisturbed, and why the creatures that emerged from such worlds carried darkness in their very souls. The Korthek Empire had conquered 12 star systems and enslaved billions of beings, but they had never faced an enemy that viewed total destruction as just another tactical option. They were about to discover what happened when apex predators met the children of a world that killed everything weak enough to die. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace, like predators stepping into sunlight, their dark warships cutting through the void with mechanical precision that made the Zephyrian observers tremble. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Vengeance, watching the crystalline cities of Zephy's Prime grow larger on his tactical display. Behind him, his crew worked with the quiet efficiency that came from years of training for moments exactly like this one. The Zephyrian welcoming committee had gathered in their capital's main spaceport, their translucent forms flickering with nervous patterns of light that served as their emotional language. Ambassador Veltar moved among his people, trying to calm their fears, but even he felt ancient terror rising in his crystalline core as the first human shuttles descended through the atmosphere. Colonel Ryan Brooks was the first human to step onto Zephyrian soil, his heavy boots making sounds that seemed too loud in the delicate acoustic environment the aliens preferred. He was followed by Major Kate Wilson and Sergeant First Class Tony Garcia, each of them carrying the kind of scars and bearing that marked professional soldiers. Their forward-facing eyes swept the gathering crowd with automatic threat assessment, and their exposed teeth gleamed when they attempted what humans called smiles. The Zephyrians had prepared themselves for this moment through months of research and cultural briefings, but nothing could have readied them for the physical reality of meeting creatures from a death world. These beings moved like liquid violence barely contained in humanoid form, their every gesture suggesting explosive capability held in check only by discipline and training. "Welcome to Zephy's Prime," Ambassador Veltar said through his translation device, his form pulsing with colors that indicated formal greeting protocols. "We are honored by your presence." Brooks nodded, and the simple motion made several nearby Zephyrians step backward instinctively. "Thank you, Ambassador. We're here to assess the tactical situation and begin planning defensive operations." As the humans were escorted through the crystal corridors of the Zephyrian capital, curious aliens gathered to observe these legendary Deathworlders. Children pressed against transparent walls to stare at the visitors, their young minds trying to process beings whose very existence defied everything they understood about life in a civilized galaxy. Dr. Callahan, the Zephyrian Minister of Sciences, approached Major Wilson with scientific curiosity overriding her natural fear. "Major Wilson, may I ask about your species' physical capabilities? Our research suggests that humans possess unusual resistance to injury and pain." Wilson paused in her examination of Zephyrian defensive installations and turned toward the alien. "Scientist, what kind of resistance are you referring to, Doctor?" "Our medical databases indicate that humans can continue functioning with injuries that would incapacitate most galactic species." "Is this accurate?" Wilson rolled up her sleeve, revealing a network of scars that made Dr. Killinan's form flicker with shock. "These are from various combat operations. Laser burns, projectile wounds, chemical exposure, blunt force trauma. Standard occupational hazards for human military personnel." The Zephyrian scientist's translation device struggled to process her emotional response. "But how do you function with such extensive tissue damage?" "Scar tissue is actually stronger than normal skin," Wilson explained matter-of-factly. "Human bodies adapt to damage by becoming more resilient. Pain teaches us to survive." Dr. Killanen backed away slowly, her scientific curiosity replaced by horrified understanding. These creatures didn't just survive injury, they used it to become more dangerous. The cultural exchange continued throughout the day, each interaction revealing new aspects of human nature that disturbed their alien hosts. When Sergeant Garcia accidentally cut his hand on a piece of sharp crystal debris, the nearby Zephyrians began flashing distress patterns and calling for medical assistance. Garcia simply wrapped the wound in cloth and continued his equipment inspection. "Sergeant," Dr. Callanan said, her form pulsing with concern, "you require immediate medical attention. That injury could become infected." Garcia looked at the shallow cut and shrugged. "It's just a scratch, Doc. I've had worse injuries from shaving." The concept of daily self-inflicted wounds as part of grooming rituals was so alien to Zephyrian thinking that Dr. Killanen required several minutes to process the information through her translation device. Meanwhile, Colonel Brooks was meeting with the Zephyrian military commanders in their war room, studying holographic displays that showed Korthic fleet movements and battle formations. General Velkus, the highest-ranking Zephyrian military officer, explained their defensive strategy with obvious pride. "We have positioned our fleets in 3 defensive rings around the system," General Velkus said, his form brightening with strategic confidence. "Each ring can retreat to the next if casualties exceed 5% of total forces." Brooks stared at the tactical display for long moments, his expression unreadable. "General, what do you consider acceptable losses in a critical engagement?" "Our military doctrine considers any engagement that results in more than 2% casualties to be a significant defeat," Velkus replied. "Losses exceeding 5% constitute a catastrophic failure requiring immediate retreat and strategic reassessment." The human officer was quiet for so long that the Zephyrian commanders began to wonder if their translation devices were malfunctioning. When Brooks finally spoke, his voice carried undertones that made their crystalline forms resonate with subharmonic fear. "General, in human military doctrine, we don't begin counting casualties until losses exceed 20% of engaged forces. We consider a battle won if we accomplish our strategic objectives, regardless of the cost." The Zephyrian war room fell silent, except for the soft humming of their technology. General Velka's S-form flickered through several color patterns before settling on a pale blue that indicated profound confusion. "Colonel Brooks, surely you don't mean that human forces would continue fighting after losing 20% of their strength?" "General, human forces have continued fighting after losing 80% of their strength. We have historical records of individual units fighting to the last soldier rather than surrender strategic positions." The implications of this statement rippled through the assembled Zephyrian officers like shock waves. They were dealing with a species that viewed death as merely inconvenient, creatures who would sacrifice entire armies to achieve tactical objectives. Captain Morrison arrived at the war room later that evening, bringing with him Commander Rick Stone and Chief Medical Officer Dr. Alex Turner. The expanded human presence seemed to fill the delicate Zephyrian space with an aura of barely contained violence that made the aliens increasingly uncomfortable. Dr. Turner was reviewing Zephyrian medical data when he made a discovery that would fundamentally change how both species viewed the coming conflict. "Colonel, you need to see this. Zephyrian pain sensitivity is approximately 50 times greater than human baseline." Brooks looked up from his tactical analysis. "Meaning what, Doctor?" "Meaning that what we would consider minor discomfort is agonizing torture to them. A Zephyrian soldier wounded in combat would be experiencing pain levels that would cause most humans to lose consciousness immediately." The room fell silent as the implications became clear. The Zephyrians weren't cowards or weaklings. They were simply operating with completely different physical parameters. What humans considered normal battlefield conditions would be literally unbearable to most galactic species. Commander, Stone was studying Korthic battle recordings when he made his own disturbing discovery. These enemy formations assume that casualties will cause immediate retreat. Their entire tactical doctrine is based on inflicting just enough damage to force surrender. They've never fought an enemy willing to accept massive losses for strategic victory, Morrison realized. They have no concept of fighting a species that gets more dangerous as it takes casualties. General Velkus approached the human officers with obvious reluctance, his form flickering between hope and terror. Colonel Brooks, our intelligence reports indicate that the Korthak main fleet will arrive in approximately 4 of your Earth months. Will your forces be ready? Brooks smiled, and the expression made every Zephyrian in the room step backward instinctively. General, human forces are always ready. The question isn't whether we can fight the Korthak. The question is whether they're ready to fight us. As night fell on Zephy's prime, the human officers continued their planning sessions while their alien hosts tried to process what they had learned. These Deathworlders didn't just fight differently. They existed in a completely different reality where pain was fuel, death was acceptable, and victory mattered more than survival. Ambassador Veltar stood in his private chambers, watching human shuttles moving through the darkness like hunting predators. He had asked for help from the most dangerous species in the galaxy, and now he was beginning to understand what that truly meant. The Korthik Empire was about to encounter something they had never imagined, creatures who viewed warfare not as a political tool, but as an art form perfected through millions of years of survival on a world that killed everything weak enough to die. The mining world of Kepler 442b hung in space like a brown jewel, its surface scarred by centuries of resource extraction that had fed the growing Korthik Empire. War leader Thakmer stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying the approaching human fleet with the confidence that came from conquering 47 star systems without a single significant defeat. The humans had deployed their ships in formations that violated every principle of galactic naval warfare, spreading their vessels across impossible distances with no apparent coordination between units. Thakmer's tactical officers analyzed the enemy positions with growing confusion, unable to identify any coherent strategy in the chaotic human deployment. War leader, his chief strategist said, his reptilian features showing the scales-down posture that indicated respectful disagreement. The human formation appears to be deliberately sacrificing tactical cohesion. Perhaps they are inexperienced in void combat. Thakmer nodded, his own scales shifting to display confident dominance. Begin standard suppression protocols. Target their command vessels and maintain firing solutions on their retreat vectors. When they lose 5% of their fleet strength, they will surrender according to galactic convention. What happened next would be recorded in Korthik military archives as the moment their empire first encountered true madness disguised as military doctrine. Jake Morrison's voice crackled across human communication channels with calm precision. That made his crew smile with predatory anticipation. All vessels implement Alpha 7 engagement protocol. Remember, we're not here to win a battle. We're here to teach a lesson. The UE's vengeance accelerated directly toward the Korthik flagship, ignoring the concentrated fire that was stripping armor from her hull and venting atmosphere into the void. Behind Morrison, his bridge crew worked with mechanical efficiency, even as emergency lights bathed them in red warning signals and damage reports scrolled across their displays. Commander Rick Stone watched his tactical screen with professional interest as human casualties mounted past levels that would have caused any galactic fleet to retreat immediately. Captain, we've lost 11% of our forward screening elements. Acceptable losses, Morrison replied without taking his eyes off the main display. Continue advance. Thicmer watched in growing disbelief as the human ships maintained their attack despite suffering casualties that should have ended the engagement minutes ago. His own fleet had barely taken any damage, yet somehow the humans seemed to be gaining tactical advantage through their willingness to absorb punishment that would cripple any civilized force. War leader, his communications officer reported, the human vessels are not retreating. Their casualty rate has exceeded 15%, and they continue to advance. Impossible, Thicmer snarled, his scales flashing anger patterns. No species fights beyond acceptable loss parameters. They must be malfunctioning. The first human boarding pod struck his flagship moments later, cutting through the hull like predatory teeth biting into prey. Thicmer felt his ship shudder as explosions echoed through the corridors, and he realized with growing horror that the humans had somehow turned a naval engagement into close combat. Colonel Dan Hayes led the boarding assault personally, his combat armor scarred from dozens of previous engagements and his weapons modified for the kind of fighting that galactic military doctrine considered barbaric. Behind him, his assault teams moved through the Korthig vessel with practiced efficiency, using tactics that no civilized species would consider employing. The Korthig defenders were skilled warriors by galactic standards, trained in honor-based combat that emphasized minimal casualties and strategic retreat when conditions became unfavorable. They had never faced enemies who used their own wounded as mobile weapons platforms, who fought more viciously when injured, and who seemed to view death as merely another tactical option. Sergeant Major Carlos Rivera kicked open a blast door and found himself facing 12 Korthig soldiers in defensive positions. Any civilized species would have retreated or called for reinforcements, but Rivera simply activated his personal shield generator and charged directly into their crossfire, while his squad flanked from both sides. The Korthig warriors were so shocked by this suicidal assault that their return fire became erratic, allowing Rivera's team to close to hand-to-hand combat range where human advantages became overwhelming. Within minutes, the entire Korthig defensive position had been neutralized by tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. Major Kate Wilson was coordinating ground operations on the planet's surface, where human forces had deployed, using methods that defied galactic military understanding. Instead of establishing secure perimeters and supply lines, her troops had scattered into small, hunter-killer teams that operated independently behind enemy lines. The Korthig ground commanders found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Human squads appeared without warning, struck with devastating efficiency, and vanished before reinforcements could respond. Traditional defensive formations proved useless against enemies who treated the entire battlefield as their territory. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Brooks had divided his forces into units of 5 soldiers each, implementing what human military doctrine called pack hunting tactics. Each team operated with complete autonomy, using improvised communications and instinctual coordination that seemed impossible to outside observers. Team 7 reporting successful elimination of enemy communications relay came a voice over the tactical network. Moving to secondary target, Team 12 has disabled enemy supply convoy, proceeding to establish ambush positions along reinforcement routes. Team 3 requests immediate medical evacuation for wounded personnel. Brooks smiled as he monitored the communications flow. The Korthig were learning what every enemy of humanity eventually discovered, that humans fought as a species, not just as individuals. Each soldier was part of a larger organism that became more dangerous when injured, more coordinated when under pressure. The Korthig commanders tried to adapt their tactics to counter human methods, but they were operating from fundamentally different assumptions about warfare. Their doctrine assumed that enemies would retreat when casualties became unacceptable, that supply lines were sacred, and that combat followed predictable patterns based on rational cost-benefit analysis, operated from completely different principles. They accepted casualties that would devastate any other species. They treated supply lines as optional conveniences, and they fought with an emotional intensity that turned rational calculation into meaningless mathematics. War leader Thakmer received reports from his ground commanders that described combat scenarios that seemed impossible according to galactic military science. Human soldiers continued fighting with injuries that should have been immediately fatal. They coordinated attacks without apparent communication systems, and they used psychological warfare techniques that targeted primal fears most species had forgotten they possessed. War leader, his chief medical officer, reported, "Our soldiers are requesting retreat from combat zones. They claim the humans are using some form of mental warfare that causes panic responses even in veteran troops." Thakmer studied battle, recordings that showed human soldiers advancing through weapons fire that should have stopped any assault, their faces displaying expressions that his species recognized as hunting behaviors. These creatures weren't just fighting a battle, they were enjoying it. Dr. Helen Parker monitored Korthak communications from her position aboard the human command vessel, analyzing enemy psychological responses with scientific detachment. The aliens were experiencing something completely outside their understanding of warfare, fear of individual soldiers, rather than strategic formations. "Colonel Hayes," she reported over the tactical network, "enemy morale indicators show significant degradation across all combat zones. They're beginning to treat individual human soldiers as strategic threats rather than tactical units." Hayes smiled as he cleared another section of the Korthak flagship, his assault teams having penetrated to within 2 levels of the enemy command center. "Doctor, that means the psychological warfare component is working as intended. They're starting to fear us as individuals instead of just as a military force." The battle continued for 18 hours, long past the point where any galactic engagement would have concluded with honorable surrender and acceptable casualties. The humans maintained their assault with mechanical persistence, treating the extended combat as merely another day at the office. When war leader Thakmer finally ordered his forces to retreat from Kepler 442b, his fleet had suffered only 8% casualties, a victory by any rational measure. But his soldiers were traumatized, his commanders were questioning their tactical doctrine, and his intelligence reports described an enemy that fought according to principles that violated fundamental assumptions about civilized warfare. As the Korthak fleet withdrew, Captain Morrison stood on his damaged bridge and watched the enemy ships disappear into hyperspace. Around him, his crew worked to repair battle damage with the casual efficiency of professionals who viewed 18 hours of continuous combat as a successful training exercise. War leader Thakmer paced the command deck of his expanded fleet, his scales displaying the deep crimson patterns that indicated barely controlled rage. The humiliation at Kepler 442b had spread throughout Korthak space like a viral infection, carrying with it whispers of doubt that threatened the Empire's fundamental beliefs about warfare and dominance. The High Command had assigned him 3 additional battle fleets and explicit orders to crush the human anomaly before their unnatural fighting methods could spread panic throughout Korthak territory. 1,200 warships now moved through hyperspace toward the human staging area at Proxima 7, a force massive enough to sterilize entire star systems. War leader, his chief strategist reported, intelligence suggests the humans have deployed only 60 vessels to defend the Proxima system. Even accounting for their unusual tactics, the numerical advantage should ensure rapid victory. Thakmer's scales shifted to display confident determination, but privately, he felt the cold touch of uncertainty that had haunted him since watching human soldiers fight with wounds that should have killed them instantly. These Deathworld creatures operated according to principles that violated every assumption about rational behavior. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the command center of Proxima Station, studying tactical displays that showed the approaching Corphic Armada with professional interest rather than concern. Around him, his staff worked with the calm efficiency that came from serving under officers who viewed impossible odds as merely challenging mathematical problems. Captain, Commander Rick Stone reported, long-range sensors confirmed 1200. Enemy vessels approaching our position. Estimated time to weapons range is 6 hours. Morrison nodded without taking his eyes off the display. Commander, signal all vessels to implement Omega Protocol. Inform the crew that today we demonstrate why humans don't retreat. The bridge crew smiled with expressions that would have terrified any civilized species, their faces showing the kind of anticipation that predators displayed when cornering particularly challenging prey. They had trained for moments like this their entire careers, and the approaching battle represented an opportunity to practice their craft on a truly worthy opponent. Dr. Helen Parker monitored communications intercepts from her position in the intelligence section, analyzing Corthic fleet chatter with growing fascination. The enemy commanders were still discussing casualties in terms of acceptable percentages, still planning tactical withdrawals when losses exceeded their comfort parameters. Captain Morrison, she reported over the internal communication system. Enemy psychological profiles indicate they expect us to surrender when our losses reach 20% of fleet strength. They have no contingency plans for extended engagement beyond that threshold. Morrison's smile held all the warmth of absolute zero. Doctor, they're about to learn that humans consider 20% casualties to be the point where we stop. Holding back. The Battle of Proxima 7 began with conventional tactics as the Corthic fleet deployed in standard suppression formations, targeting human command vessels and communications arrays with methodical precision. War leader Thakmer watched his tactical displays with growing satisfaction as human ships began taking damage and venting atmosphere into the void. War leader, his weapons coordinator reported, enemy losses have reached 15%. They should begin retreat protocols within the next few minutes. Instead, the human fleet accelerated directly into the Corthic formation, their damaged vessels spearing through enemy lines like predators accepting wounds to reach vital targets. The UE's vengeance, her hull breached in 17 places and her crew, working in vacuum suits, rammed directly into a Corthic heavy cruiser and began boarding operations while both ships were still locked in collision. Morrison fought his way through the enemy vessel's corridors while his ship burned around him, leading assault teams that treated the combined wreckage of both vessels as merely another battlefield environment. Behind him, his crew continued their duties, even as sections of their ship vented into space, their training allowing them to function in conditions that would have incapacitated any other species. Captain, Commander Stone reported through his helmet communicator, we've lost primary power and life support is failing throughout most of the ship. Acceptable, Morrison replied while cutting through a blast door with his plasma torch. Continue mission objectives. The Corthic crew of a captured vessel found themselves fighting enemies who seemed completely unaffected by the fact that their own ship was dying around them. Human soldiers advanced through sections that were open to vacuum, coordinated attacks despite having no functional communication systems, and continued fighting even when their armor was breached and they were bleeding into their environmental suits. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Brooks was conducting simultaneous ground assaults on 17 different Corthic-held worlds, each operation designed to maximize psychological impact rather than strategic value. His forces had been scattered across enemy territory in small units that operated independently, striking targets that seemed randomly selected but combined to create a pattern of terror that spread throughout Corthic space. On the industrial world of Corthic Prime 7, Major Kate Wilson led a team of 12 soldiers against a military complex defended by over 300 enemy troops. Any civilized species would have considered such odds to be suicide, but Wilson's team approached the mission with the methodical planning that humans applied to all forms of violence. Team Alpha will create diversionary assault on the eastern perimeter, Wilson explained to her soldiers as they studied reconnaissance data. Team Beta will infiltrate through the maintenance tunnels and eliminate command personnel. Team Gamma will establish overwatch positions and provide fire support. The assault began at local midnight, when Korthak forces were at their most vulnerable, according to human intelligence about their sleep cycles. Wilson's diversionary team attacked the eastern defenses with enough violence to convince the enemy that a full battalion was assaulting their position, while her infiltration team moved through the facility's infrastructure like hunting predators. The Korthak defenders found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move, that struck from directions they thought were impossible, and that treated the heavily fortified complex as merely another hunting ground. Within 4 hours, the entire facility had been neutralized by 12 soldiers, who accepted casualty rates that would have caused any galactic military force to abort the mission immediately. General Pete Sullivan was coordinating what human doctrine called applied psychological warfare across the entire theater of operations. His staff had analyzed Korthak cultural patterns and identified psychological pressure points that could be exploited through careful application of terror tactics. The enemy responds to isolation by increasing panic behaviors, Dr. Alex Turner reported during a planning session. Individual Korthak soldiers, separated from their command structure, show immediate surrender responses when confronted with human forces. Sullivan nodded, his scarred features showing the kind of cold calculation that came from decades of turning warfare into a science. Implement hunter-killer protocols. Small unit operations targeting individual enemy soldiers. Make them afraid to be alone. Human teams began appearing throughout Korthak territory like ghosts, striking isolated outposts and individual patrols with surgical precision. The attacks served no apparent strategic purpose, but they created an atmosphere of paranoia that made Korthak soldiers afraid to venture outside their main bases. Back at Proxima 7, the battle had entered its 30th hour of continuous combat, long past the point where any galactic engagement should have concluded. The human fleet had suffered 90% casualties, but the surviving vessels continued their assault with mechanical persistence that defied rational explanation. War leader Thekmer stared at his tactical displays in complete bewilderment, as human ships that should have been destroyed hours ago continued to function despite damage that would have crippled any civilized vessel. His own fleet had taken minimal casualties, but his soldiers were beginning to show signs of psychological breakdown from fighting an enemy that refused to acknowledge defeat. War leader, his chief medical officer, reported, "Our combat personnel are requesting relief from duty. They claim the humans are using supernatural methods to continue fighting beyond physical limitations." Captain Morrison stood in what remained of his bridge, surrounded by wreckage and breathing recycled air from emergency systems, while his crew continued their duties with casual professionalism. Around him, the UE's Vengeance groaned and shifted as structural damage accumulated beyond any reasonable repair threshold. "Captain," Commander Stone reported, "we've lost 97% of our fleet strength. Tactical analysis suggests we should consider strategic withdrawal." Morrison looked at his friend and smiled with the kind of expression that had made humanity legendary throughout Deathworld space. "Commander, we haven't lost 97% of our fleet. We've concentrated our remaining firepower into the vessels most likely to complete mission objectives." The Korthak High Command gathered in their ancient war chamber on the Empire's capital world, their reptilian forms displaying the scale patterns that indicated deep cultural shame. For the first time in their species' history, their military forces were refusing direct orders to engage enemy forces, and entire battle fleets were abandoning conquered territories rather than face the Deathworld creatures that had redefined the meaning of warfare. Supreme War Leader Keth-4 stood before the assembled commanders, his massive form showing the scars of countless victories that now seemed meaningless in the face of humanity's impossible tactics. Behind him, tactical displays showed the steady collapse of an empire that had dominated galactic civilization for over 2,000 years. "Report," Keth-4 commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had once made entire star systems tremble with fear. War Leader Thakmer approached the command platform, his scales flickering with the colors of defeat and confusion. "Supreme War Leader, our forces have abandoned 17 star systems in the past month. Our soldiers refuse to engage human forces, claiming that the Deathworlders cannot be defeated through conventional warfare." The silence that followed this admission stretched across the war chamber like a physical weight. The Korthic Empire had built its reputation on the certainty that superior numbers and advanced technology could overcome any enemy. But the humans had shattered that assumption with tactics that defied rational understanding. "What casualties have we inflicted on the human forces?" Keth-4 asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would bring no comfort. "Supreme War Leader," Thakmer replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "human casualty rates have consistently exceeded 80% in every major engagement. By all mathematical calculations, their military should have ceased to exist months ago." Keth-4's scales shifted to display the deep purple of philosophical confusion. "Then how do they continue to fight?" The question hung in the air like an accusation against the natural order of the universe. The Korthic had studied warfare for millennia, had perfected military science to the point where battles could be predicted with mathematical precision. But the humans operated according to principles that made their own expertise irrelevant. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the command center of the human flagship UE's Retribution, studying intelligence reports that showed the complete psychological collapse of Korthic military forces throughout their empire. Around him, his staff worked with the quiet satisfaction of professionals who had accomplished exactly what they had set out to do. "Captain," Commander Rick Stone reported, "our deep reconnaissance teams confirmed that Korthic forces are abandoning defensive positions across their entire frontier. Some units are retreating without any human contact whatsoever." Morrison nodded, his scarred features showing the kind of grim satisfaction that came from seeing years of planning reach successful conclusion. "Commander, signal Admiral Kane that we're ready to begin the final phase of operations." The assault on the Korthic capital system began with a human fleet that consisted of only 47 vessels, many of them so heavily damaged from previous engagements that they barely qualified as spaceworthy. Any rational military analysis would have declared such a force insufficient to threaten the heavily defended core world, but the humans had long since moved beyond the boundaries of rational military thinking. Colonel Dan Hayes led the advance. Elements of the invasion force, his troops deploying onto the Korthic homeworld with the methodical efficiency that had become their trademark throughout the campaign. Behind him, Major Kate Wilson coordinated ground operations that targeted not just military installations, but the entire infrastructure that supported Korthic expansion. The Korthic defenders had prepared elaborate defensive positions designed to channel attacking forces into killing zones where superior numbers could overwhelm even the most determined assault. What they encountered instead was an enemy that treated elaborate defenses as merely interesting obstacles to overcome through creative application of violence. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Brooks divided his forces into hunting packs that moved through Korthic territory like predators following scent trails. His soldiers had studied their enemy for months, learning to anticipate Korthic tactical responses and exploit the psychological weaknesses that made them vulnerable to sustained pressure. Team 7 reports successful penetration of enemy command. Bunker, came a voice over the tactical network, eliminating command personnel and communications equipment. Team 12 has located enemy supply depot, initiating demolition procedures. Team 3 requests permission to pursue fleeing enemy commanders into civilian areas. Brooks smiled as he monitored the communications flow. The final phase of human operations had nothing to do with destroying Korthic military forces and everything to do with breaking the will of an entire civilization. His soldiers were conducting what human doctrine called comprehensive system disruption, targeting every aspect of organized resistance. The Korthic civilian population watched in terror as human forces moved through their cities with surgical precision, dismantling not just military targets, but the administrative and logistical networks that kept their empire functioning. These Deathworld creatures fought with a level of organizational sophistication that made their savage reputation even more terrifying. Supreme War Leader Kethvar received reports from his planetary commanders that described military scenarios beyond his comprehension. Human forces were simultaneously attacking targets across 17 different continents, coordinating operations that spanned thousands of kilometers while maintaining tactical surprise that should have been impossible. Supreme War Leader, his chief strategist reported, "The humans appear to be targeting our command structure rather than our military forces. They are systematically eliminating every officer above the rank of unit commander." Kethver studied tactical displays that showed his empire's command network collapsing like a house built on sand. The humans weren't trying to defeat his armies. They were decapitating his entire civilization by removing anyone capable of organizing resistance. Dr. Helen Parker monitored Korthic communications from her position aboard the human command vessel, analyzing the psychological breakdown of an entire species with scientific fascination. The aliens were experiencing something completely outside their cultural framework, the complete dissolution of military hierarchy under pressure from enemies, who treated organized resistance as merely another problem to solve. Admiral Kane, she reported over the command network. Enemy communications indicate widespread panic among civilian populations. They are referring to human forces as supernatural entities that cannot be stopped through conventional means. Admiral Lisa Kane studied reports from the surface operations with professional satisfaction. The humans had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. They had broken an empire without destroying its military forces, simply by demonstrating that resistance was futile against enemies who viewed death as tactically acceptable. End came not with a climactic battle, but with a transmission from Supreme War Leader Kethvar that would be remembered throughout galactic civilization as the moment when predators recognized apex predators. His message was broadcast across all Korthic frequencies and transmitted to human command with a simplicity that transcended species barriers. "We surrender." The two words carried with them the weight of an empire that had dominated galactic civilization for millennia, spoken by creatures who had never before acknowledged defeat to any enemy. Captain Morrison received the transmission while standing in the ruins of what had once been the Korthic High Command, surrounded by the wreckage of a military machine that had conquered hundreds of worlds. "Admiral Kane," Morrison reported over the communication link, "enemy forces have offered unconditional surrender. Korthic military commanders are requesting immediate cessation of hostilities." Kane's response came without hesitation, carrying the authority of a species that had redefined warfare through applied violence. Terms are as follows: complete withdrawal from all conquered territories, payment of reparations to every enslaved species, and permanent restriction of Korthic military forces to defensive operations within their core systems. The silence that followed stretched across interstellar space, filled with the weight of an empire acknowledging its complete defeat at the hands of creatures from a death world that most civilizations avoided on their star charts. "Terms accepted," came Kethver's reply, and with those words, the Korthak Empire effectively ceased to exist as a galactic power. The aftermath of the human campaign spread throughout civilized space like shock waves from a stellar explosion. The species that had asked Deathworlders for help received their protection, but they also learned why most galactic civilizations treated Earth as a forbidden zone marked with warnings about dangerous predators. Ambassador Veltar stood in his crystalline chambers on Zephy's Prime, watching human peacekeeping vessels patrol the space around his homeworld with emotions that his translation device struggled to process. His people were safe, their civilization preserved, but they had paid a price that he was only beginning to understand.